Hello, everyone. Welcome on our conference. And as the next I will be your moderator for the next talk. It will be presented by Tariq. I'm not sure, but pretty much think that you are aware who is Tariq, because he's very famous in this testing area, has had a lot of presentation and talks on several conferences in the past. So he's a well-known name here, and he will talk about how to combine force multipliers to improve quality. So I would pass the words to him. Please, if you have any kind of questions during the presentation, just type it to the chat, add to the community page, and after the presentation, we can come back to the questions and Tariq will answer on them.
All right. Thanks, Joseph. So yeah, thanks everyone. Again, a pleasure to be here at the Global Online Conference. And we're going to talk about force multipliers. It's kind of a age-old concept, but one that is very relevant, and we're seeing a lot of traction right now as relates to force multipliers. So it's pretty timely. As was mentioned, my name is Tariq King, Managing Principal in Technology Consulting at EPAM, and kind of spend my time supporting, quality, testing, engineering excellence, agile, anything related to, high quality engineering and delivering and engineering productivity. And that's kind of like where this topic stemmed from. A lot of the things that we do in software engineering, which is a hard problem, should contribute to us becoming better and more effective at what we do. And so that's where this idea of force multipliers within software engineering kind of came as a topic. So we're gonna just walk through an introduction of what force multipliers are, discuss specifically force multipliers in software engineering and how we can combine them, and then start looking at the impacts on software quality and testing. All right, so I'm the proud father of two daughters, Mackenzie and Soraya, and they are always kind of feeling like they're superheroes, right? No matter what you ask them, they're always able to say, yes, I can do that, Daddy, no problem. And so the question becomes like, if we are faced with the interesting situation where Soraya has a boulder in front of her that looks pretty sizable, could she actually move this boulder? And the answer is probably not. Like, she probably could not move this on her own in that current state. But what if she had something like this, right? If she has a lever, then she can use that lever. She exerts the force or effort around that pivot, and all of a sudden she can move that load. And so it's not unheard of that we leverage things like this. And to move this load with this lever is probably feasible depending on the strength of the lever, right? But the lever ultimately makes the job easier, right? It acts as a force multiplier, reducing the effort that is needed to move this load and increasing that distance from the pivot really helps to multiply that force, right? So the theme there is that a relatively small force can have a much greater effect or impact. But what if it was Mackenzie, right? And Mackenzie is the younger one. She's 5 years old, and she thinks that she can do even more. So, can she lift this Tesla, right? And I think we all know how much these vehicles weigh. So that would definitely not be feasible. But if she had a hydraulic jack, using Pascal's law, you can exert pressure on that liquid, and that small cylinder kind of still has this equally asserted force that goes across all parts of the fluid to kind of lift the vehicle upwards, right? So though you have, again, a very small effort, it is multiplied, the larger that area, and that force multiplication is what actually lifts the car. And so what is the theme here? The theme here is really, work smarter, not harder, right? And I think that, especially in software testing and quality, we could all relate to that. But in general, anywhere in software engineering that we can kind of start to apply these principles is a good thing. All right, so it's time to step into this idea of force multiplication by kind of arming ourselves with knowledge about what these things are. And obviously, the first good example of force multipliers are tools. Tools are very straightforward. If you have like a hammer, a saw, like these things help to kind of increase productivity by using these tools. But it's also good to note that not necessarily all tools are created equal, right? There's tools and then there's power tools. And if you have power tools, then you can do even more, either bigger jobs or do the same jobs a lot faster, depending on the task at hand. And so, we commonly think about these tools and even broadening that out to technology, but there's other types of force multipliers, right? People can be leveraged as a force multiplier, depending on your skills, and we'll talk about that and what you bring to the table. Sometimes one person can do the work of 10, right? Depending on that person. And then there's processes or methods that are also force multipliers. So we're going to step through each of these, right? First, technology as a force multiplier. Like when we talk about technology, we're really talking about how do we transfer scientific knowledge into practical use, right? And make it something that we can use day to day. And if we look back in time, one of the key advancements that drove the Industrial Revolution was this steam engine, right? And this is obviously in a museum somewhere now. But back in 1712, we had this first successful commercial engine that could do continuous power. And, these stationary steam engines powered factories. They became the basis for replacing sails on ships, paddle steamers, locomotives, railways. I mean, everything was kind of transformed by this technological kind of revolution here. And so I think that's pretty clear that, in general, technology is a force multiplier. But people, right? You start thinking about a team, right? Or maybe an individual, and you start having these different areas of force multiplication, right? And so first to note is not just about just adding more people to get that out of the way, but a good individual contributor, right? Tom Brady holds nearly every major quarterback record, right? Passing yards, completions, touchdown passes. And once he's on the team, he's acting also as a coach as well as an individual player. And the other team members are benefiting tremendously from his presence. In a similar fashion, the team itself or multiple individuals kind of working together can also be a force multiplier, right? So Michael Jordan, who's legendary, Scottie Pippen, and Dennis Rodman. And you always think about the different dimensions that they bring to the team, whether it be offensive or defensive or very strategic. And so another great example of how people can be force multipliers. And then third on the spectrum is the idea of a process or a method. It could be a whole system, right? Thinking about the assembly line, right? The The assembly line, if you consider the production of a car and certain steps within that, in traditional production, like only one car would be assembled at a time. But if we're now leveraging, let's say the engine takes 20 minutes to install and the hood takes another 5 minutes and the wheels take another 10 minutes, then you can produce one car in 35 minutes, right? But in an assembly line, you will split those tasks around several stations and work them simultaneously. Now, assuming now that the largest step, which is your engine, is 20 minutes, the first car might take 35 minutes, but beyond that, you're now producing a new car every 20 minutes, right? So, of course, we know that nowadays these things are highly automated and production has become even more efficient as a result of these things. So process is definitely important. And then as particular method, right? So we can think of the popular movie 300, Spartans versus the Persians. Of course, 300 soldiers compared to the size of the Persian army was nothing. But they had a particular method, right, that they employed, where they used this phalanx approach, where you could have the soldiers line up next to each other, have their shields overlap, and point their spears out beyond the shield front. And then during the frontal attack, it was almost like this now very small army became like this wall, almost like it became like a tank, where they're multiplying their force and creating a defense that is hard for any army to attack front on. And so, again, just an example of how you can kind of do more with less. Of course, the major disadvantage here was that if it assumed that all these soldiers would stay together, if anyone kind of fell out of this formation, it went off. But nonetheless, force multipliers, key part. So technology and tools, people and process, as well as methods. All right, so what about software engineering? And I love to use this this slide here because, again, all the different elements that we talked about can come into play. You have the person behind the keyboard could act as a force multiplier. The tools that they may be using, the windows that are open also may act as a force multiplier. Or maybe the person that they're collaborating with in the chat in the upper right-hand corner, or even the coffee mug is labeled as a force multiplier, and we'll talk about that. So the key here is that there's many different aspects of force multipliers that we have within software engineering, and we're going to step through a few, right? The first thing to think about is that, yes, of course, we have engineering tools. We have libraries, frameworks, platforms, etc. And these are different things, even though people love to use these terms interchangeably. But the major point here is that if you can take something existing that has been built off the shelf, like a library, and plug it right in, that is an accelerator. Or further yet, if you have a problem that now you're tackling for the first time, but has been solved, and there's a framework in place, right, that gives you the skeleton of everything that needs to be in place, and now you just have to start plugging things in. Also another force multiplier. And then a very key part is an entire platform that you can now have components and that are working, and now you can build off of that platform or even just plug into it and start going. Entire DevOps tool chains, right? So it's not just about a single tool framework. You can have this support and collaboration across the entire lifecycle. So everything from your project management or your product engineering, right? Your operations and delivery, all these different aspects, collaboration tools, all kind of come into place with tooling in software engineering. And then automation, right? So we normally don't disassociate tools from the ability to automate, but the difference here is that you're leveraging those tools to actually reduce manual labor. So at a true level, something that was manual can now start, operate, and complete independently of everything else. And so here, I'm not talking more specifically about test automation, but just automation in general across the board. So, all right. So now when you start thinking about, automation, there's a lot more beyond just implementing a tool, right? There's practices, patterns, and different playbooks that can also be reused across. And so all of these different guiding principles, all of the recurring knowledge from whether it be a design pattern or a particular test pattern, are all things that help with acceleration and help with force multiplication, or maybe something more tactical like a playbook where, yes, there's actual code now that you can plug on in that has been tested or proven and tried and true over the years. And this is really cool, right? Because we get into building entire reference architectures and streamlining them across your software engineering process. And then one other key part of this is like there's a level of maturity that comes along with this thing. And I remember looking at this world quality report now that's like 4 years old, right? And it was talking about a couple things. The first one was the fact that like test automation itself is this single biggest enabler of maturity in QA and testing, right? And of course, we're going to bring this conversation from being general to being very focused on how we leverage force multipliers, how we combine them to improve quality. So automation is a key component of that. But then the other interesting thing in this report, again, like 4 years old, was this note here on artificial intelligence, right? And it specifically called out artificial intelligence as a force multiplier for QA and testing. And I think that we could agree, as we are now inundated with chat GPT and large language models, we can certainly see the force multiplication that certain things that one person may have taken a longer time to do can now really be automated quite quickly. And even though it's not perfect and there's still flaws, like it does give you a boost of acceleration in terms of productivity. And so wherever we can leverage these things, and if we can even combine, right? If you start thinking about automation and AI as a force multiplier, like can we actually combine these things? All right, so how do we do with AI and machine learning? And it's worth a discussion, right? There's many applications, as we've seen. People have been trying these things out all across different organizations, right? But can we leverage AI and machine learning to do things like validate requirements, right? And there's commercial tools out there, IBM's Requirement Quality Assistant and Scope Master, which is more of a startup company, that are looking at how can we actually automate that requirements are complete, correct, consistent, unambiguous, and even quantify some of those metrics using AI and machine learning. Of course, goes without saying, GitHub Copilot and using AI for things like code generation. So on that side, not just generating IntelliSense of method signatures to help the developer, but now entire methods and blocks of code, or even an entire framework can be spit out by these things. And similarly, on the code generation front, there's been unit test automation that has been able to generate, and we've seen that again with companies like DiffBlue, but also now with the rise of GPT-4, we're seeing it get better and better at not only code generation for development, but test code as well. And then, And then there's a whole bunch of other use cases, right? There's self-healing, there's use of computer vision to actually do test automation. It's not just about the large language models. There's several other areas and aspects of AI and machine learning. We have some of our own open source projects like Selenium, and there's other startups again out there that just looking at computer vision like DevTools AI. There's also reporting and analysis, right? Failure analysis, report portal. Again, all open source initiatives that are leveraging AI and machine learning to help improve some aspect of testing or quality, right? So all the way from requirements through the design and the generation of code, and then even the analysis of the results. All right, so when it comes to people, it's important to understand that these are our most valuable resource. And when we start thinking about people as force multipliers in software engineering, there's a concept that I love, which is the concept of the 10x engineer. And there's a lot of debate, right, whether or not this is really true, right? The statement is that most productive engineers can be 10 times more productive than their average counterparts, right? And I think about this in a number of different ways, right? Well, if I have 10 engineers developing the wrong code or the wrong tests, they can certainly be outperformed by one engineer developing the right code and the right tests. Similarly, one engineer can be more productive than a team of 10 if he or she can model the problem and solve that problem, design it in a way where there's an order of magnitude less work to do, right? Again, coming back to working smarter, not harder, per se. And then the 10x engineer, will find insights and solutions that would not occur to the average engineer, and therefore avoid entire categories of problems, right? And as we know, when it comes to the software engineering process, the more that we kind of accumulate issues along the way, and the further down the pipeline it becomes, the more expensive they are to fix, right? And so doing things right, doing them up front, having those people have insights up front is key to this idea of a 10x engineer or 10x multiplication factor. So how can you make your tech skills kind of go further, right? First thing is just mentoring and teaching junior engineers, things like presenting and sharing knowledge both internally and externally. And I like this idea of having the engineer be almost like a networker. I'm not talking about external networking. I'm talking about within your organization, like being able to be someone that sees that there's a particular issue that one organization is having, one part of the organization is having, and then connecting it with another that actually is building solutions for it, and doing that kind of networking also is a way that an individual kind of starts to act as a force multiplier and accelerating just by connecting the right pieces together. And then other things like publishing or creating new tools, there's blogs, white papers, there's innovation in terms of research and development, other ways that you can kind of be a force multiplier or be a 10x engineer. And then, this individual kind of effort provides a model for other teams to follow, right? And you start thinking about, okay, if I have an excellent individual, what about an excellent team, right? And could I have a template for high-performing teams, right? So an environment where maybe engineers and testers come into that environment and they're surrounded by 10x engineers, and it helps actually raise their level, right? And so if you think about this concept and think about things like centers of excellence or centers of enablement, this is kind of exactly the function that these teams kind of do, where you bring those individuals together and help to make the organization as a whole better by multiplying their efforts, right? And so there's all these phases that high-performing teams kind of go through: forming, storming, norming, and then performing. And then we also see like where they kind of impact, right? Whether it be empowering or collaboration, resilience, and alignment within the organization. And again, either looking at centers of excellence or a center of enablement kind of model. All right, so I mentioned the coffee, right? And I think it's important to understand, like, coffee itself is not the force multiplier. Although it might be for some people. I know this is a huge debate probably that I'm opening up. But when you start thinking about the culture that you create, I remember in a former life at a company I was with, we had like a time of the day where this is South Florida that I live in, so we would all get together and make cafecito, right? So someone would make Cuban coffee. And that time, that it could probably be like 10 or 15 minutes that we got together to just have that time together and laugh and joke. It was a major reset in the middle of the day that really left us energized to go back to our desks or go back to our teams and really crush it. And I always think back at that, like, what a simple thing, but the culture that you create, there's a culture of coming together and sharing and supporting each other and just having a mental break, right, to reset mental health is quite important. In addition, there's other things all around that. It's not just the coffee, but it's the, in addition to that culture, thinking about trust, having a diverse team, being equitable, all these things build trust And trust really builds performance, and performance is really what we're talking about here once we start talking about force multipliers. All right. And then from a quality perspective, I couldn't do this without talking about the crowd, right? So one of the key things in software testing and quality that we're always trying to do as testers is we're always trying to mimic what the end user might do, right? We're trying to simulate that, or somehow put on our hats to think like them and act like them. But it becomes hard. But if you have access to the real world, right, why not leverage the real world for testing, right? And so thinking about that crowd as a force multiplier, where you have access to real people, which could, of diversity of ethnicities, maybe they live in many different places and practice different cultures, right? They also have real devices in their homes, right? So being able to connect now to the kind of coverage that we need from a testing perspective once software is released into the wild. And then real conditions, right? Whether that be geolocations or some other aspect. This crowd is like a core aspect of being able to multiply the efforts, right? I mean, you bring all these things together, now you have more realistic testing that covers a lot more, and it can be done in a bit of a burst, right? Where you can add it on as a force multiplier to kind of get your quality improvements over a threshold. So thinking about the crowd as a force multiplier, being kind of having a lot of discussions with the Test.io team that build this real world platform for bringing crowd testing to the world, right, and to people. And the whole idea here is that, and this is kind of like our first traces of thinking about combining, right? The crowd itself is a multiplier, right? But then the platform that actually brings the crowd to the organization is also another multiplier, right? Because it's helping to bring and connect these people together and organizations to the crowd, right? So something to think about, whether it's regression testing, functional testing, product experience, user stories, like leveraging the crowd for real world verification, for faster feedback and integration into your workflow is a key aspect of productivity. All right, so now we're done with people, let's talk about process, right? And so, we are all familiar with the fact that like software lifecycle really determines how well things flow in an organization, right? And if you're more in of a traditional model where there's more waterfall, like this can really be an impediment to productivity, right? And so it tells us that the actual process itself, right, is a force multiplier, whether it be thinking about agile or lean principles and bringing those to the table, or design thinking, right? All of these things kind of joining them up and aligning them so that the organization can now have a good path towards flow and efficiency is a key thing, right? So whenever we think about process, think about flow and achieving not just speed, but quality through that flow, right? So visualizing work, limiting the work in progress, actually managing the flow, measuring velocity and trying to make improvements, having like short feedback loops and improving collaboration. So again, I always go back to the assembly line analogy, right? This is your assembly line, right? This process that you have in place is your way to arrange things in a way that certain things can flow quicker, they can happen simultaneously, or we can swarm on issues to fix them and continue moving throughout the process. And so, of course, there's many different flavors of this, whether you be talking about scaled agile or looking at disciplined agile. Like there's many different parts to this, and I'm not really here to be a proponent of any particular one. It's really whatever works for your organization. But the idea here is like look at your process and try to think about where you need to go with it. All right, so combining force multipliers, right? And we already hit on some that were covered already. How do we bring different multipliers together, right? So We talked about AI, for example, powered tools, right? Leveraging AI and existing frameworks that are out there to make things better. And this is something that we really need to continue to do, right? Like we need to really think about what does the next generation of tools look like. I was having discussions even up to today, again, around large language models and the potential for us to not just look at those in isolation that, yeah, like, yes, this thing can give a great textual response or maybe generate something in text for me, but how can this actually be embedded into tools and leveraging that to kind of bring all the tools up to a new level. We also covered this idea of, leveraging tool chains with automation plus process and culture, right, as part of it. And the whole idea of DevOps is just that, right? So thinking about, DevOps practices in modern software engineering is exactly this idea of combining these force multipliers together, right? Obviously having a good culture of shared responsibility, being very efficient, automating things wherever you can. And then we talked about the crowd a little bit, right? And there's actually like a lot here for me to unpack in that. Like when I think about the crowd and the real world in combination with like 10x engineers or testers on a team, putting those two things together is actually quite powerful already, because you have people with great testing skills, right? Formal testing skills, but then you have real users, right? That have real devices and their real locations, and you have the platform bringing it together. And then maybe if you could add one more thing there, it would be to incorporate AI and machine learning into that stack as well, to streamline it even more. And so I think the call here for folks is to really just start thinking about in your own organization, what force multipliers exist, right? And then how can you combine them? And maybe there's a non-trivial way that you can combine them that really gives you a big boost or a big ROI, and actually figuring out and kind of testing that theory and putting it into practice. All right, so the general approach here is thinking about these things from a very holistic manner, right? How can you baseline where your organization is at in terms of some area of productivity, and then construct a plan, implement it, and track it, and then monitor it so that you can actually evolve and kind of keep it at the forefront for success. And I usually use the analogy here of, it's better to kind of enable folks, right? So your goal should be enablement and growth. You don't give someone a fish, you teach them how to fish, right? And so being having that mindset, and then coupling that with being very strategic with your schedule and your timeline, when to execute, how to look at these improvements, how to fill any gaps in expertise. So for example, as you're thinking about this, maybe in your organization, one of the key challenges is that you don't have the right people or the right expertise from people, team players, like leading things. So maybe there's a gap. And it's not because the people there aren't super valuable. Maybe you just don't have a particular role, right? Maybe there's a quality architecture role that you wish you had, right? Maybe how you can fill that or augment that first, and then go from there to thinking about, well, how do we eventually like train someone in the longer term or enable them to fill that role so that we don't have to bring in external help or external consultants, right? And that, again, that should be the goal of enablement. Perhaps a similar thing is around automation, right? Like maybe, automation is going to be a longer term initiative, right? Maybe to see the ROI from the automation project, it'll take some time to design and build out the framework. And so while you're building that out, you could be working on some other areas of the transformation, like maybe it be people, or maybe it be shifting the organizational culture, where you can, start to see force multiplication happen up first, right? Up front. All right, so here we are to kind of like round it up to quality and testing. And, I always like to give this equation and analogy, Q equals P, which has become like a mantra in how I think about software quality and testing, right? Which is that this is an equation where quality equals productivity. And what does that mean? Well, as an equation, if anything changes on one side of the equation to hold true, the other side also needs to, or is also impacted, right? So if quality declines, then you're probably becoming less productive, right? You're spending more time working on issues and fixes and so on and so forth, and less time working on delivering new features, right? Similarly, the converse already is going to be true, where if you improve quality, then you can spend more time delivering faster and less time working on bugs and issues. And then there was a similar kind of philosophy by Edward Williams Deming, not necessarily around data. It's just a very cool quote that he had there. But he actually looked at quality as well, and the quality for him was equal to the results of work efforts over total costs. And he says, like, when an organization primarily focus on quality, then this tends to have a reduction in costs and overall increase in productivity. And when they do the opposite, the opposite happens. And so as we think about force multiplication in the organization and how it impacts quality and testing, if we think about testing as this effort that we, first of all, can invest in, right? So there's a cost of the testing effort. If we invest nothing, then we're at the 0 point, right? But maybe we have some function where we have labor and assets and we pay for that. On the other end, that's our investment in testing. But there's also another cost that's implicit here, which is that the less that you actually do and the poorer the job of actually investing in testing, you still pay a cost, right? And initially, like, this D of T is very high. In other words, your escape defects is very high if you do little to no testing, right? And as you invest in testing, you actually get back exponential returns, right? Because the first set of testing will reveal quite a bit of issues, right? It becomes easy to find those first set of defects. But over time, it becomes the law of diminishing returns at play, right? It becomes very hard. You might be over testing, looking for that next defect, and it's not really worth it. And the whole goal here is that, at the end of the day, you have to balance what you invest in software testing and quality with the risk of losing customers and having poor retention or increasing the burden on the support organization. All of those things are costs, and your total cost is really these two curves like added together, right? And so what does this have to do with force multiplication? Well, this looks like a very theoretical exercise. But the whole idea here is that at first, like, when we start thinking about how we optimize this curve, which is the lowest point, right? The lowest point where you have the lowest total cost is where you want to be. These force multipliers, they're helping us to do more with the same or less, right? So whether that be people and process, or it be tools and technology, in general, you'll start to see that as you start thinking about finding better ways to be efficient and actually reducing like manual labor, it starts to have a big impact on this particular curve, right? And so what happens here is that now your investment costs become lower, right? Because now you're either employing a tool or automation, and so you're having to use less people to actually complete this testing effort. Or maybe you're now moving from a model where you had 1x engineers to 10x engineers, right? So again, still efficiency, and that lowers that testing investment. And what that has an effect on is that now your total cost of quality, your quality curve looks like this, and the difference between these two things is your cost reduction. And so again, it is a big picture of first thinking about what in your organization helps you to be more efficient, more effective. What can you leverage for that? So whether it is modifications to your way of doing things, to your process, whether it be a new tool or some technology, or whether you're thinking about down the line your automation and these things all kind of flowing together, into some new streamlined process, right? And all of that really helps us to put a grasp on how do we actually become more efficient at what we do in our organization. All right, so some final thoughts, right? In terms of this, first thing, just to summarize, like this force multiplication is really like a very powerful concept. We think about it and use it every day in our lives as part of what we do. But in disciplines like software engineering and software testing, there's a level of importance, I think, that as we become more strategic, that we have to be thinking through and thinking about how we're putting these things together. So understanding those different types of force multipliers is the first step to driving that organizational change, and critically thinking about where your organization is at with respect to those things. And then being strategic about how you put these things together, how you schedule them, how you lay them out as part of your digital transformation process. And last but not least, just may the force be with you as you go forward and you think about these things in your organizations. I encourage you all to kind of just share that knowledge and kind of discuss everything that kind of is working for you and maybe not working, because that's how we become better as a community. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, Tariq.
Yeah.
I just would like to ask the audience to ask questions if they have any, because I don't see anything on the community platform and even on the YouTube channel as well. But let's give some time to them. Maybe they will start to ask questions. But before, so until this, what can you, I don't know, what can you see as the future if we are talking about this type of topic, forcing multipliers in testing? What can be the future in this area for testing and for quality engineering?
Yeah, I think that the future of this is really us getting better at integrating and combining these different types of force multipliers. So right now, for example, like with all the buzz around like AI, part of it becomes like we see how like these large language models can really help us, but at the same time, we also see that they're fallible and they start to hallucinate, right? And if you don't have like a human expert that is really leveraging these tools, then you can't necessarily stitch all these things together so easily. So it forces us, it's almost forcing us to think about how do we bring all these things together, right? And possibly into a framework and a platform, as well as a supporting process. I think that that's where the future of this will be. And people who kind of get these recipes for streamlining, testing and the tooling and building something that pulls them all together, will have something incredible at the end of the journey.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And if just the AI related stuff is coming to the picture, because it's currently maybe the biggest buzzword and trend in all of the software engineering topic. What do you think? Which type of traditional role can be mostly affected if we are talking about this topic as combining force multipliers and AI? Because AI definitely will be part of this area as well.
Yeah, I think it actually forces us, in terms of roles, I think it forces us to really consider blurring the roles, right? Like I was having a discussion this morning just about business analysts, right? And now like business analysts leveraging like some of these different tools that are out there can now help to build requirements, maybe even generate tests and go from there all the way through, right? The question becomes like, can we, for all roles collaborating together, actually this combination, can it help us to improve productivity across, right? So I see everyone kind of being impacted and affected. And it really just boils down to what are the best use cases that we see as we experiment with these things.
Okay, thank you. And I know it's really hard to say anything because maybe it's a bit early to see it how things will go in the near or in the far future. But any advice to the audience or to those who are um, interested in this topic and would like to dig deep into it, which way to go, what to choose, how to start?
Yeah, I would say, there's probably plenty of opportunities. You go into a given organization, and there's probably plenty of opportunities to apply this stuff, right? I think one of the things that like I wanted to emphasize here is that it's not just about tools. Of course, like tools and these things are very flashy. When we talk about AI, that's very exciting. But everyone in their organization has a process. They have different people. They have upskilling. They may or may not have a center of excellence. Like just kind of looking at and being like kind of productivity minded and seeing what is out there that can help your organization move to the next level. Because sometimes people feel that like keeping knowledge to themselves or whatever is the way to go to kind of have job security. But actually, if you can create a more productive workforce, if you can contribute to the bottom line by combining these things in a way that may not be so obvious, right? Or just bringing it to your organization. I think that's the don't be afraid to kind of try to do something different and test it out and see how it works.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for your answers. Meanwhile, I'm checking the questions. Still no questions from the audience. So mm, I think that's it from now. So thank you everybody for attending on this presentation. Thank you, Tariq, for the very nice presentation slide set and for answers on the questions and advices. Hopefully, everybody was happy during this presentation and had a good one. Thanks again for everybody for the participation, and see you later on the
Yeah.
next talk.
All right. Thanks, you, Joseph. All right.
Cheers. Have a nice day.
You too. Bye.